Hi everyone, my name is Marianne and I'm an international student from mainland China. And a lot of the time I feel that this one piece of my identity plays a lot of impact in my engagement with other people. When I think of the news, when I think of what has been talked about as Chinese international students, I remember the McLean piece of Two Asian. I remember some articles on the Vantage College at UBC saying that are we having too many Chinese international students coming? While questions in my head is, what about the attention that has been shipped away, that why don't we question the money-seeking intention of UBC? Or when we hear things like 2 years ago, UBC published a piece titled "Why Don't Chinese International Students Bring Democracy Home?" And it's concluded that they don't do so because of political fear, hostility, inability, and indifference. And I want to say that coming here and see that this piece of my identity as Chinese international students, especially from mainland, I see this as coded with different notes of very ambiguous, conflicting notions. For example, power. For example, intimidation, threat, which you can hear a lot from Donald Trump's videos, and exploitation or poor in human rights. And all these things that I feel is my identity. Somehow my nationality is very interconnected with my political standing, it's very political, it's very economic. And then from that I see a very interesting perception of how other people see me when they realize my identity as a Chinese international student as both threatening, yet vulnerable, always subject for blaming. And I feel that this is an otherness of discourse. And meanwhile, coming here to study at UBC or in Vancouver, in Canada, I started to see the importance of race, which I really realized back in my home country. And it's probably also because of my privilege, because I'm from the Han, and this is the ethnic group that dominate, culturally, socially dominate the Chinese society. And then meanwhile, I hear students who angrily argue that they're not Chinese, but they're Taiwanese. Or I have friends from Hong Kong who getting really angry when there's anything associated with Chinese, with even the language Mandarin, that they think it's associated with mainland Chinese. And that was the point that I think, if UBC is a unique place that brings off different complex identities, which under the code of Chineseness, and when we see their differences and misunderstandings, then why don't we have the space for dialogue, for sharing, for talks?
Thank you. So I'm going to be reading notes off my phone, so please don't think I'm like tweeting or something. But so Marianne talked about the difficulties as an immigrant coming into Canada and kind of bring herself into this community. I'm going to be talking about the reverse and how it was like for me to actually enter into the Chinese community and kind of the struggles I faced from them coming as an outsider. So I'm going to open with something Dr. Zheng Weiwei said in an interview with Al Jazeera. And Dr. Zheng was the chief advisor to the former president of China, Deng Xiaoping. And when he's giving this interview with Al Jazeera, he says, the Chinese understand the West much better than the West understands China. And that's something I want you to keep in mind when I discuss my personal experience. So I was born in Pakistan, and I left Pakistan when I was 4 years old. I grew up in Canada. And when I grew up in Canada, I spent most of the time in Greater Vancouver, which is a very colorful area, as has been described. And I lived in a region that was predominantly Chinese and Mandarin-speaking Chinese. So as a result, as I grew up, Mandarin vocabulary became something I used very daily in school. And as a natural result of that, I got a very strong interest in Chinese culture, and with my other friends in high school who were also Chinese with these Chinese parents. Different culture, different language, but as I grew with it, it kind of became a part of myself, something I adapted to. So in a sense, my Pakistan was my birth culture, but then Chinese became an adopted culture of mine. And when I got to the age where I was going to enter UBC, I was extremely excited because I thought UBC would be this very great arena for discussion and trading of ideas. And I can finally bring this pent-up energy I have from my Pakistani and Chinese identity and kind of have open discussion about that in UBC. However, when I arrived, I was shocked to see that there was a gatekeeper who would not let me pass, that I could not actually have this open dialogue with the Chinese community, the greater Chinese community outside of Vancouver. Because for the internationals who came to China, who came to UBC to study, or even many Chinese scholars I've talked to in the mainland, they had some biases. And there are two of these which I would like to talk about. The first one is ownership of the language, and the second one is monopoly on the culture. So ownership of the language basically means that although I grew up speaking quite a bit of Chinese, to them that didn't really matter. Because to them, when I spoke Chinese to them, they wouldn't reply back to me with their ideas in Mandarin. They would say, "Oh, your Chinese is so good. You speak our language very well." To which I felt compelled to reply, "No, I speak my language really well. We just happen to share it." And as a result of that, it became really hard to have discussions. And I find this really strange. If we had a third generation Chinese child, and that he was not born in China or she didn't grow up in China, yet she spoke Chinese, we would call that a Chinese person speaking Chinese. If we had a Japanese person, a third generation Japanese person who's never stepped foot on Japan speaking Japanese, that would be a Japanese person speaking Japanese. Yet, when I, in a similar setting, learned and spoke Chinese, I was a foreigner speaking a foreign language. And I found that very disappointing. After all, I didn't learn this language in order to impress the waitress. I learned it to communicate, to actually, as a result of necessity. So that impaired dialogue because I wasn't able to speak to them as an equal in their own language. The second problem was a monopoly on the culture, or cultural understanding. So in almost every dialogue, and this includes in the aforementioned interview with Al Jazeera, whenever there was a discussion with an outsider of the Chinese community discussing Chinese problems, there would always be a reply of, "You don't understand us, you're not Chinese, and our people are very complex." And that's what I got when I initially came to UBC, and I wanted to discuss Chinese politics or history. I got this response that you only understand 2% of Chinese culture, it's 4,000 years old, which, by the way, is factually incorrect, and you can't understand it at the same level we can. So I spent 4 years in Asian studies specializing in China. I also studied 4 years in international relations, also specializing in China. And after all this time, just last week, I got the reply, "Oh, you don't actually understand China, you have no right to say these things." So no matter how much I would try to please or how much I would try to study, there would always be this strong barrier of, "You are not one of us, therefore you don't have a place to discuss anything about us." And this was quite frustrating. And not only was this common in one-on-one conversations, I found there was no actual space to discuss openly about about Chinese problems or Chinese politics. And when I first came to UBC, I was really excited to find these places. I found an organization called the Chinese Student Scholar Association. Sounds perfect, right? I go there, and even there, I encounter these same problems. And when I was in part of that association, they had a term for me. They called me the Pakistani guy because I was the only Pakistani in this room full of Chinese people that was actually talking. So anytime I would enter any of their conversations, any of their events, any of their panels in the future, they would always refer to me as, "Hey, you're that Pakistani guy, right?" As if I didn't have a name of my own. And in fact, this sometimes got to the point where instead of just calling me the Pakistani guy, they abbreviated it. And they started calling me Baji Sitan, which means Pakistan. Not Pakistani, Pakistan. They called me Pakistan as if I was the nation state itself. Mind you, I only grew up in Pakistan for 4 years. I have no right to represent them, but because of my visual representation, that is what I became in their eyes. Other social clubs I joined had similar problems. They, instead of calling me Pakistan, would call me Wai Guo Pangyo, which is Chinese for foreign friend, which is quite odd because I believed I lived here, and being called foreigner here in the place where I grew up was a very strange feeling. And oftentimes they would end up talking over my head. So they'd be like, oh, that foreign guy, we have extra food, tell that foreign guy you can get seconds. And I'm sitting right there, and they just speak over my head in Mandarin, because of course I wouldn't be able to communicate with them. So that's the sort of problem I found when I first came to UBC, and it was this great void of discussion. So Marianne mentioned 2 years ago there was a very controversial article by the UBCs and by several other news outlets, many of them based in Vancouver, many of them international. And me and Marianne had a discussion about what we can do about that. And along with many other very passionate students, an organization called Hua Dialogue was founded. And I should probably just do this, because there you go. Hua Dialogue was founded. And this was an organization that works very differently, because it stopped becoming something about our language or their language, because in Hua Dialogue we had this rule, and that was always speak from the I. And then in Hua Dialogue we started to have discussions about social and political issues, and whenever people would speak, they would never say, our way is this way, or our language is this way. They were only ever allowed to say, my way is this way, and I think such and such. And so when I participated in these discussions, it stopped becoming our language, it became my language, and another person would say my language as well. And it kind of brought down these barriers that were put up. And as a result of the support from the Equity Office, we also got professional training in diplomacy to help encourage people to speak as equals. That is also part of one of the places we got this speak from the I notion. We encourage people to not see each other for their visual representation, so they may not appear Chinese or they may appear Pakistani, but that's not necessarily what they are. And it is these sort of ideas that I really hope can grow in UBC, because they were lacking when I first came here. And I believe that Hua Dialogue has actually expanded to the point where we're starting to invite people who do not have a Chinese background and will discuss what they feel about these issues as equals. Of course, we do run into challenges. We still have those people that say, oh, you don't understand Chinese people, or you don't have a right to speak. But Hua Dialogue is designed in a way to counteract that. Our infrastructure is designed that if someone becomes very vehemently opposed to the opinions of others, they have a safe space to vent it out, rather than shutting down the conversation by saying you have no right to speak. And
so what is Hua Dialogue actually? Let me explain it, just the Hua. So Hua, or making a full term Huaren, it describes the people who culturally, political, in terms of nationality, in terms of culture, in terms of ethnicity, and or that you feel you belong to the Chinese or the Hua communities. So it's an umbrella term. And it comes into a lot of lessons into settling into a term like that instead of saying Chinese, because complexity is really set behind this term. And I would also talk about how this dialogue came into being. It's actually happened this room 2 years ago. And it was also at a roundtable discussion, and I was sharing, expressing my interest of having a dialogue on campus. And I think, and then very soon, I gathered support from the Institute of Asian Research, the Center for Chinese Research, and later on we got funding from the Equity Enhancement Fund, and it keeps going for 2 years. And we host events every month. We have different topics, range from, say, school uniform, death penalty, to personal identities, to nationhood. and we're able to include individuals, say their parents from two different ethnic or cultural backgrounds. Students who identify themselves as Chinese Canadians, but does not necessarily have been lived in China. And then I want to let C to talk about some of the conflicts and what we can learn from our own experiences. Because I feel that today we have talked a lot about the importance of dialogues, but what about when we're having dialogues, when we actually make dialogue happen and it's keep happening, and what are the barriers, what are the lessons that we can learn from these? And I think this is a very important place for us to share this to everybody.
Okay. So, as I mentioned before, we had, actually I'm going to be a little bit quick with this because I don't want to steal time from other presenters. But as I mentioned, we got professional training in what's known as deep diplomacy. So it's essentially teaching people to have conflict resolution by trying to understand the perspective of other people. And that's something we tried to implement very heavily in Hua Dialogue. And that's with help from the Equity Office, who's got us in touch with the professionals to give us that sort of education. But that also allowed our organization to have the infrastructure to resist people who are sometimes either resistant to open dialogue or sometimes feel very sensitive about open dialogue. And in that way, we can kind of bring them into the circle as well. And people would have otherwise not been part of the conversation suddenly can share their ideas. So one of the ways that we do this is when people think that an individual does not have the right to speak, for example, as I mentioned before, we would allow them to say from their experience why they believe that way. So if someone says, you're not from Taiwan, therefore you cannot talk about Taiwanese politics, that's a very strong statement, and we try to bring it back to their personal experience. So we'd say, what of your personal experience leads you to think that someone would need a Taiwanese background to understand politics? Or if they say Hong Kong history is very complex, we would ask, what experience can you share that demonstrates the complexity of Hong Kong culture? And it's things like these that allow us to bring it back to the individual, that prevents the discussions from becoming an us versus them, between one race or another race, or intra-race, such as Taiwanese Chinese and mainland Chinese, and makes it into a conversation about individuals. How do we, as 44 individual students and people, think of this topic, and how can we come together on some common ground? Have I missed me? Thank you. So thank you, and our events are both open to any participant. You don't necessarily even have to be a UBC student, and we encourage anyone with unique ideas and perspectives to join our future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.